issues that are not really respective to one particular culture, but they involve the U. I mean, when the nuclear catastrophe happened in Japan, the U.S. responds, Russia responds. I mean, you hear this, like, you see this ripple all over the world, and with the stock markets, it's the same thing. It's like the stock market experience isn't just particular to Japan or particular to China, but everybody's affected by it. So my question is, in terms of like a core curriculum at Columbia or even classes, is there some sort of need for a class that's set up in terms of like a transnational framework where it starts with issues that span cultures and then approaches them with that they're not so specific to one particular area?
You want to answer that, or you want me to? I think what you're talking about is what President Bollinger is talking about, globalization. I think that's fine, but I don't think you should start with globalization. I think you should start with getting some critical understanding of your own tradition, where you are, and then see what you can draw from that you would share with others. Otherwise, you're simply exposing yourself to the effects of the market economy and through learning, education, simply following economic opportunities. Okay? And I think that's not the way to go. You have to have some ability to evaluate those market trends, the prevailing global trends. You shouldn't just jump into them. I couldn't disagree more with President Bollinger on that approach.
You say it's not the way to go, but is it the way it's going? And I guess what I mean by that is when we talk about interpretation, which is really what we're talking about in sociocultural context, isn't the market economy or the capitalist mindset something that can be used as the bridge, as the nexus between different cultures based on the fact that there's this new understanding of mutual dependence that I don't think was present prior to this era of globalization. The idea that we rely on the East as much as the East relies on us is, I think, a new development. And I would like to hear your opinion on maybe how important that is in shaping this new philosophy of harmony in terms of academia.
I think it's very important. It's certainly something that we have to consider and take into account. But in order to understand the present process, I think you have to recognize that America was unique in having an open frontier for so long and unlimited natural resources to exploit. That was not the case in Asia. India and China and Japan all had to make do with very limited resources. So they faced the natural limits on what they could expect to do. That was part of their culture. It was not that much part of our culture. Our idea was, there are no limits, Be what you want to be, and don't worry about it. But that's not realistic, certainly not realistic today, as you say. We are part of a global economy. We're very interdependent. So the great unlimited freedom that we have enjoyed up to this time is clearly being limited. Opportunity is being limited. In many of the same ways that the Asian peoples have had to face for centuries. Right? I think that is a significant background factor. That's why I think we are finding some things in their experience that are relevant to our own situation today. How much they will find in our experience that's relevant to theirs remains a question, but we'll see.
You talked about how we had unlimited resources given the frontier versus Asian cultures developing along kind of more economic scarcity. How does that play against like another driving force in Asian culture is Buddhism? And I was in Professor Thurman's class and he talked a lot about how kind of a driving force between how Buddhism developed in India before it came to Asia was because they had such overwhelming supply of food, because India is so rich agriculturally, that allowed kind of this dropout type of religious movement to come about and flourish. And then that influences what you were saying is a more kind of hampered agricultural culture. It just seems like two conflicting influences.
I don't necessarily see the conflict. Fact is, Buddhism was a product of economic affluence, right?
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
See? And it dealt with the limits of human satisfaction depended simply upon affluence and self-satisfaction. All right? You had to confront that problem. There was only one response to that challenge early on in Indian history. All right? There were other attempts to deal with it, not exclusively Buddhist in the sense that you were speaking primarily of Theravada Buddhism. But Jainism was another response to some of the same challenge, and the forms of Hinduism that developed another response to the problem of how you're going to live within the limits, let's say, of the Indian subcontinent, with the resources that were available. The resources were not available to the extent that they had been in the West because of the tendency in the West to reach out again and again and again, reach further, to explore new lands and so forth. That was not a characteristic of Indian civilization at that time, nor was it of China at all. Something of that existed in Japan. But for the most part, because of the limitations, the physical limitations, the material limitations of the Japanese archipelago, the Japanese were facing those limits very early on, and they had to deal with the problem of how you sustain a population that's growing, continued to grow, obviously, the population continued to grow. How did they deal with it? All of them. They didn't stop growing. They grew intensively, not extensively, the way we did. They developed intensive agriculture. And they did it very well. They learned how to support, in China, a large population on a relatively limited area of land through intensive cultivation. Human inputs, okay? You get more out of the human side of it than you do out of the material side, okay? And they did reasonably well with that. They didn't develop the kind of industry that we did, or the technology that went with it. But in terms of sustaining a large population, they did extremely well. And they have every reason to believe that some of the things that they learned in that process will sustain them in a new era where the world at large is learning to live within limits. You know, you're not going to go to the moon and deal with that problem. All right. For all the space exploration you engage in, the natural instinct on the part of the West to explore more, but there's no likelihood that that's going to solve your problems.
I read an interesting article lately, just it's extremely relevant, about how mining asteroids in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter will create the first individual trillionaires. So they're actually are looking to.
I know.
They don't really have the means to get up there yet and do that.
What would you make of the especially of Japan's 1930s period, when I think that maybe that intensiveness, they relied on an expansionist phase to seek resources and land outside of Japan?
They had learned to do the Western thing. Okay. And they were giving it a good try. And they did it fairly well, better than most of us recognize. But they made the big mistake of listening to their zealots in the Privy Council who said, charge ahead no matter what.
In the West, there's a cultural acceptance, for lack of a better word, nowadays, of what we call